So sorry, everybody has to unmute himself
Yeah.
and turn on video again. Sorry for that.
No worries. Yeah, Esther, to answer your question, so we have the full hour, but I think it maybe makes sense to plan around 20 to 30 minutes and leave a bit of time for questions and discussions afterwards.
Yeah, we might be a little more on the 30-minute side. We'll see.
That's perfectly fine.
I'm also happy to share these slides later if we go through anything quickly and people want to reference the slides later. And I would just ask folks in the audience, I think you've all been muted by default as a function of the recording, but feel free to just unmute yourself and ask questions throughout. I really prefer talks where I'm not just like talking at you for 30 full minutes, but hopefully if you have any questions, just speak up or put your question in the chat. And Isabel, maybe you can monitor and ask the questions if people don't want to turn on their mics. And let me do, okay. So we need to grant teams access to my screen. Just a second. I don't know why I have to do this every time.
No worries.
Okay, I gotta leave and come back.
Sure. See you in a bit. Okay. Until Esther is back, if anyone has any questions or feedback, we can also use this time right now. Feel free to speak up. Otherwise, we're going to give it a minute. No, perfect. And you're still on mute.
All right, I'll try this again. Now, can you hear me and see the slides?
Yes.
Okay, great. The downside of this is I cannot see any of you, or the chat. So please do mute yourself and ask your questions if you have them. But with that, I will go ahead and get into it. So hi, everyone. For those of you who I haven't met yet, my name is Esther. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Colorado, Boulder in the computer science department. And today I'm mostly going to be talking about one way of generating Earth embeddings, and that's MOSAIKS, a project that I guess we published in 2021, so it's a little old now, but was really my first foray into Earth embeddings. And then I'll talk about some of the more recent work in that space and what I'm working on now as well. But I haven't gotten the chance to share MOSAIKS with this group yet, so I wanted to start there. But the whole vision here is taking Earth observation data and representing it in vector form where that vector should be useful. That's kind of the mile-high view of what I think of as the premise of Earth embeddings themselves. And I made the intro slides a little bit brief here because I think we're hopefully all aligned on the opportunity here. So over 800 petabytes of Earth observation data coming in, and more is on the way. I love this diagram from ESA because it shows it's not just one type of data coming in either. We have satellites that are going to come into orbit in the next 5 years, giving us really diverse information, diverse types of data that span many different application areas, as you see here, from combating climate change to monitoring land and safeguarding the Arctic. So as an AI and machine learning researcher, which is my focus, I see this as a huge opportunity, right? It's an amazing amount of data, an amazing variety of data that can enable science at crazy new scales, especially for environmental monitoring across disciplines, across really impactful areas of application, as we see here. But I would say still, but especially if we zoom back to even 2016 is when I started my PhD in computer science and when I started working with satellite imagery. And I really humbly had no idea what was going on. Then especially, but I would say still now, just accessing and harnessing the potential that Earth observation data has, and especially the potential for AI and machine learning techniques to process Earth observation data, it remains a technical and computational challenge for many. And this is something that I had to learn over time. As a computer scientist, I was used to working with big data sets and spinning up GPU clusters, and all of that was very familiar to me. But when we started the project that I'm going to tell you about first here, it was in collaboration with folks in public policy and agriculture and resource economics, people who were not really used to accessing and storing large data sets, dealing with specialized and powerful compute, like handling GPUs was not familiar. And there's still quite a bit of siloing of where the AI and machine learning expertise sits among companies, among departments at universities. And so to realize the broad impact that AI and Earth observation can have across the sciences, across policy, NGOs, there's still barriers that many of us in machine learning still are dealing with these barriers, right? But they're actually like literal roadblocks for a lot of people who don't even see themselves as potentially using Earth observation data to further their science. So, I mean, the key insight behind why we can use embeddings, a general purpose representation of satellite imagery, is even if we're just looking at RGB imagery here, this data provides information about so many different downstream tasks, from forest cover, desertification, road networks, maybe water quality, infrastructure. It could tell us about snowpack. And so the landscape of having many different models that are task specific, this has its place, right? One model to predict forest cover, another to detect desertification, and another for road networks. That was really the landscape when we started the MOSAIKS project. And the idea here, we didn't call it Earth embeddings yet, but it really was the idea of Earth embeddings, right? So we don't want every single researcher studying one of the tasks on the right here to have to create their own model. They might not have machine learning expertise on their team. They might not have the storage to handle large databases of imagery. So what we wanted was one succinct representation of satellite data that is general purpose enough to be useful for all of the downstream tasks that satellite imagery could be useful. And so this is the idea behind MOSAIKS, which stands for multitask observation using satellite imagery in kitchen sinks. And you can see that it really is an embedding, right? We're taking satellite imagery from across the globe, and we're feeding it through an unsupervised featurization process that I'll talk about, I think, on the next slide, or very soon. And then what we're doing is forming a pre-computed high-dimensional embedding of the globe. MOSAIKS is on a 0.01 degree grid resolution, so roughly 1 by 1 kilometer per grid cell. And then now we just have an embedding database or matrix, right? And the idea is really users of this embedding data set can now predict forest cover, fill gaps in population density, maps, any of those prediction tasks from the previous slide, or many, many more. And in reference to those bottlenecks or barriers from the previous slide, MOSAIKS is really quick and versatile. It runs on like minutes on a grad student laptop from 2018, so even faster now. And crucially, it abstracts a lot of the need for deep learning expertise for handling the images, because users can work directly with the embeddings, right? They can work directly with this data set that we've processed for them. And so I think hopefully this all resonates with folks who are working on Earth embeddings or excited about them. So what exactly is the key that's unlocking all of this in MOSAIKS? Well, it's how we actually process the images into these feature vectors. So I think right now, the dominant way of doing this for large embedding data sets is to use Earth observation foundation models, where actually this is like, we did this project pre-foundation models. So this is actually just a totally unsupervised, I guess you could squint and call it self-supervised method of obtaining feature vectors from imagery. So I'm hoping a lot of people are familiar with convolutional neural networks. This is just a really wide and shallow one-layer convolutional network where we are randomly initializing the filters in that network with patches of the training set of data. So it's really just convolving those D filters across the image, taking a nonlinearity and average pooling. And so it's really simple at the end of the day compared to deep networks. And so one of the things I like to start with is like, why can we get away with such a simple, wide and shallow model for satellite data in particular? Well, if we contrast to natural imagery, which has been such a test bed for computer vision models, these are two images of red pandas from the ImageNet dataset, canonical computer vision benchmarking dataset, versus two composite aerial satellite images of the US. And we see that there's structures in the satellite image that make things largely scale and orientation invariant versus the natural images on the left, where you really have to have a model that can figure out that both of these are red pandas, even though the face is going to appear in very different parts of the image at very different sizes. And so that's one of the motivations for having the multiple layers of the network that we might not need with the structure of satellite imagery. So that's the motivation, the intuition. We compared our model MOSAIKS to a fine-tuned ResNet 18. Remember, this is like 2021 when the paper was published. And we're comparing, these are all regression tasks. So we're comparing on the basis of R2, R-squared score. So that's going to be between 0 and 1. It can actually be negative, but you don't want it to be, obviously. And we can see that MOSAIKS is a couple R-squared points below the ResNet 18. And note that the ResNet 18 was fully fine-tuned separately for every task. And where MOSAIKS really shines is in the runtime, though. So this is 2 minutes on a laptop versus the blue bars take about 8 hours on a V100 GPU on an AWS instance. And so if we think back to potential users who are not computer scientists, who don't know how to deal with AWS, they can really quickly test out, oh, is satellite imagery going to be helpful for my task, my 8th task that isn't on this slide, before they invest in doing something much more complex and resource intensive. And it's worth noting that you don't get this performance for free with any unsupervised method. So the orange bars here are similar in runtime to MOSAIKS. It's passing the imagery through a pre-trained ResNet 152. And there is some signal, but it's much, much worse than either MOSAIKS or that ResNet 18. Okay, so overall, really, I would say simple model architecture, and I think there's something to be said for simplicity and something to be said for simple but effective baselines. So a proud moment for me as a researcher was when years after our paper was published, another paper led by Isaac Corley found that MOSAIKS is in fact a effective baseline, and it's one of the ones that they recommend. So random convolutional features is the backbone behind MOSAIKS, and it's recommended along with an ImageNet pre-trained model and image statistics, really canonical baselines. And zooming forward to quite recently, MOSAIKS is this possibly too small for you all to see. This is figure 1 from the Alpha Earth Foundation's paper, where they show their performance next to the next best model on all of these different tasks on the horizontal axis here. And MOSAIKS is I guess, the winner of the second best, if you will. It's the next best method in 5 out of 15 of their tasks. And that I hope goes to show kind of the value in simplicity here. It really is minutes on the laptop, and I think that is one of the reasons that MOSAIKS remains kind of unique in this category of Earth embeddings models. So if you're interested, you can go to mosaiks.org is the website where you can find all of this information later. There's like a point and click, upload your CSV of locations and download embeddings feature there. And both random convolutional features and the specific instantiation of that is the MOSAIKS algorithm are on TorchGeo. So I encourage you to take a look and hopefully use this and baseline against it in your research. And I want to highlight the number of people who really made this research to accessibility aspect of the project possible. So we had a fantastic team here. I was honored to represent this team to receive the Digital Game Changers Award from the United Nations Development Program and the International Telecommunications Union in 2023. And that was so exciting because it's kind of a validation of what we were hoping, that if we could make Earth observation data, satellite imagery, actually multispectral satellite imagery in particular, accessible to a bunch of people, that would open so much more opportunity and hopefully change the game with respect to really important sustainability challenges. And one of the pieces of evidence in that direction, and something that I'm really proud to be a part of, is the Togo Data Lab. So this is a partnership with the government of Togo and the Center for Effective Global Action, CIGA, which is an organization on the west coast of the US. And what's really exciting about this is we're using MOSAIKS as part of the Togo Data Lab to help train folks across the ministries in Togo to be able to use satellite imagery and machine learning for agricultural prediction, for helping monitor infrastructure development, things like this. And the kind of the take-home point here is all of that training we would really have to reimagine how that would be done if we had a model that needed GPUs to run. The idea that MOSAIKS is lightweight, that it runs on a laptop, allows this training to reach way more people with the limited resources that we have computationally for the Togo Data Lab. Another recent project leveraging MOSAIKS, and again, like, it really shines in this large scale prediction space, is in estimating the footprint of artisanal and small scale mining across sub-Saharan Africa. So I'm not going to go deeply into this project because we don't have the time for it, but just as an example of what can we do with the pre-computed embeddings, prediction, wall-to-wall prediction over large scales is one of the places where I think embeddings end up being most useful in my applied and interdisciplinary projects. Okay, zooming out a little bit and thinking about this notion of why could we use a much simpler, much more efficient computer vision model for satellite imagery versus traditional natural imagery in computer vision. The dominant trend that I saw and that Hannah Kerner, Konstantin Kleber, and Caleb Robinson, who are co-authors on this position paper, says a lot of people are just taking innovations in computer vision and applying them to satellite imagery and other Earth observation data, kind of like lifting and shifting those over. And this works, right? Like you can think of satellite images like they're rasters, they work with standard computer vision models. But the idea behind this position paper is really challenging people to think about what makes satellite data and Earth observation data, and in many ways, geospatial machine learning more generally, a distinct modality with distinct challenges for machine learning. And so that goes to the idea that is central to my research, which is tailoring AI for Earth observation data, for geospatial prediction, so that we can have models that are more accurate, more usable, and also more efficient. So the thesis of this position paper is really that satellite data constitutes a distinct modality for machine learning. I probably don't have to go into a lot of detail here for this room, but there's so much richness in Earth observation data. And I think one of the really exciting things is the potential to think of data not as just the image and the label of that image. It's like image, and we label this one as a red panda. We label this image as a cat, things like that. The referential, and the variable that we're actually trying to predict, it's kind of a different mindset with geospatial prediction. We have all of these different ways of sensing what's going on at a point in space and time. And what we usually want to do is make a map of something like forest cover. And we may have multiple different windows into the forest cover or the tree canopy height in a certain region with different satellite images. And so that's exactly what Earth embeddings, image-based Earth embeddings like MOSAIKS are aiming to do, right? They're actually starting not with the image, I would say, but they're starting with a latitude longitude point, finding an image in a georeferenced database or some other Earth observation data, applying the encoder, could be random convolutional features, it could be a pre-trained model, getting a vector out. And so it really is this idea of starting from the latitude and longitude that becomes relevant here. And so, of course, MOSAIKS is one way to do this. There's the major TOM embeddings, there's Alpha Earth Foundations, there's so many more coming out. It's really, really exciting. I want to take a few minutes to talk about another exciting way of generating location embeddings as well, that takes a very different approach. So it's not actually directly referencing the imagery or the observation data itself. It is trying to kind of bypass that at the prediction level with a pre-trained model that the only input to that model is latitude and longitude. So we're actually encoding location rather than in the orange pipeline above, the model is encoding the Earth observation data. So clearly the secret sauce here is going to be in how we pre-train the weights of that green location encoder. And there's quite a bit of work we can draw from the computer graphics and imaging literature on implicit neural representations. And so the goal here is to take a 2D or 3D input space where X and Y are representing pixel space. So where are you along the X and Y dimensions of an image? And then your output is something like, what is the RGB value at this particular location in the image, or is this 3D voxel, like, is the shape in or out with an occupancy map? And so this is actually really, really similar to taking position on the sphere, on the globe. And we're gonna not output necessarily something like a particular variable like forest cover across the globe, although we could. What we're gonna do is ask this model to give us something very similar to what those image-based embedding models can do. And so I'll talk about this through SatClip, the project that I helped build. There are other models that do similar things that I'll show you on a slide coming up. But we're kind of building on this idea that satellite imagery, the same idea as MOSAIKS, the same idea as other image-based encodings that generate Earth embeddings. The idea that what we get out of that data has a high dimensional, say 256 dimensional embedding space, and it carries a lot of information about ground conditions. Now we're going to say for every image that we take, let's also take the position, feed it through a new model architecture, and the output of that model will also be in 256 dimensional space. And the way that we're going to align those outputs so that when the location and the image are the same place, we get a very similar vector output from these two models. And when they're different, we should get a different vector output from those models. It's actually fits super well with the contrastive learning objective. So we're actually just using the CLIP objective here pretty much out of the box, but instead of language and image, we're using location and image as the inputs. And so the kind of intuition figure for what's going on here is we're leveraging the image encoder's ability to extract general purpose information. It's not necessarily going to be interpretable in any way, but we're getting the relevant information about hopefully things like vegetation, infrastructure, agricultural, biodiversity. And then we're using that contrastive pre-training loss to fuse that information and that content over to the location encoder itself. And so what we get out of that is embeddings across the globe that we can compute for any latitude, longitude. We just pass it through that small green neural network. And this map is showing you the cosine similarity of these location embeddings across the globe based on different anchor points. So one in Africa and one in the northeastern US. And you can see the places that are similar in SatClip embedding space, they are often close in geography to the reference point, but not always. So there's some places that are highlighted as similar that are very far in geographic space. And this is one of the reasons that location encoders can be very nice tools when it comes to problems of predictive interpolation. So the task here is we want to interpolate between all the points with X's on the left-hand side. That's where we have data in this particular problem, and we want to interpolate the map everywhere else. And we see if we use something like MOSAIKS, that's a direct image encoder on the far right, we're able to learn kind of like the high level patterns, at least in the northern part of Africa. We're getting mostly that light blue color, but it's really speckly because those predictions are really done kind of like image tile by image tile, and we didn't do anything to enforce smoothness over the predictions. But SatClip, the embeddings are naturally somewhat smooth over space, but they're also capturing these high-level trends in satellite image variability across the globe. So they're actually giving us kind of this sweet spot of interpolation. And I, again, won't have time to go in a ton of detail on what the design choices that made SATCLIP so effective, but I'll just highlight two of the main ones, and you can go to the SATCLIP paper or this paper below, which explains the model architecture that we used for that green location encoder. That was a big part of the SATCLIP design, as well as sampling our own pre-training data set that had near uniform sampling over landmass, which ends up being a very important thing for training location encoders specifically, that distribution of the data. Okay, so we're maybe on track to do this in 30 minutes. That's great. I want to zoom a little bit back, and I've asked you to think about Earth embeddings two very different ways, right? So MOSAIKS was a model that used a database of satellite imagery and encoded basically each image in that database to compute these embeddings and then store them for others. And this way of generating embeddings more as a data set is common also to Major Tom, to Alpha Earth. You can kind of like plug and play the model and the type of data that you want to embed, and then you have this fixed embedding data set that people can download and use. And there's a lot of benefit to having those pre-computed. The other way of thinking about this was, what if we are actually trying to distill the data set itself into the weights of a neural network model, into the weights of this green model? And then the product that we share with people is the pre-trained model itself, and they can run through their latitude, longitude, hopefully eventually time and elevation into this model and compute the embeddings that way. And so there's a great line of work in this direction as well. And I'll highlight something really exciting about these last two projects that I have on the slide, is that they are actually adding more modalities in and getting toward this goal of multimodal embeddings, which I think is just such an important and exciting opportunity with Earth observation AI in particular. Okay, so I have 7 papers that I reference on this slide. There's so many more that I honestly need to update the slide, and they're always coming out. And I think everybody has a slightly different take on like what exactly we're trying to do with Earth embeddings. So that's one of the reasons that Konstantin, Mark, and I, and many other authors wrote a paper in part trying to explain like what is the commonality of all of these approaches, right? For people who've never heard of this, what is an Earth embedding? But for people who are working on this, what are the connections between all of these very different ways of generating Earth embeddings? And so this is out on Earth Archive right now. I'll give you kind of a preview of what we go through in this paper. And then I'd honestly love to get people's takes on this. I think we're going to have some time for discussion. So the unified goal here that we see is we're all taking kind of like this real world of different observation data sources, remote sensing data, in situ data, that's all referenced, again, by space and time. And we're trying to distill that, compress it, maybe even expand it into this Earth embeddings world where we have vector representations of every spatiotemporal index. And it doesn't have to be a neural network that does this encoding, but I think that's the dominant way of accomplishing this right now. And why are we doing this, right? What are the key functions that we're hoping Earth embeddings will serve? Maybe ideally all 4 of these at the same time, but I think in the near term, we're going to end up with models that are good at 1 or 2 of these functions at a time. And then we'll have a suite of kind of models that work well in different ways. We might want to think about compressing huge corpuses of data into smaller vector representations. We might think about fusing different types of modalities into a common embedding space. Something very nice about the vector representation is that it's easier to integrate with other foundation models like LLMs. And of course, the basic workflow in some sense in geospatial AI is interpolating unseen locations, making a wall-to-wall map where before we just had labels in a few sparse locations. And so that goes to the user perspectives that we outlined. So if you're someone who might want to use Earth embeddings in your research, you might be doing direct prediction like we did in MOSAIKS to fill gaps in forest cover, population density, or any other data set. You might be using Earth embeddings as a form of context to condition predictive models. So that you know, oh, this is a habitat where if I see this animal, it's likely to be an Arctic fox. Data synthesis and simulation, geosemantic search and retrieval. These are some of the key applications and uses that we outline as what people are doing right now and what is really on the horizon for near-term applications. And then coming back to a theme that we kind of talked about with MOSAIKS versus SatClip in this talk so far, as developers of Earth embeddings, I think one of the key considerations here is how are we going to share them, right? Because the whole point of Earth embeddings is to have this general purpose representation that can be used for all of these downstream applications. So how are people actually going to access and use these? So there's the explicit feature extraction way of doing things, very much like MOSAIKS or passing imagery through a pre-trained model. There's the implicit neural representation like SatClip, GeoClip, GARE, CSP are all examples of that. And then there's how do we actually share these? So we can publish the model with open source weights. We can pre-compute the data set. Both of those have pros and cons, right? And especially if we think about the database or the data set as the outcome of embeddings, it becomes very important. Okay, are we going to pre-compute this data set for all possible points that someone might ask for? Or are we going to compute that on the fly and only actually compute the embeddings as people ask for them? Of course, it's not like users, developers, and we're all in our own side, occasionally talking to each other. I think the key to making Earth embeddings really impactful in unlocking a lot of that science on the application side, but also really doing the proper way of it generating these embeddings that is really like centered along the properties of all of this diverse spatiotemporally referenced data. It comes down to a community that appreciates and really fosters its interdisciplinarity, making sure we're actually tracing the computational infrastructure that we're using here so that the costs and the kind of resource burden can be shared across the community and hopefully picked up by some of the major players. Generating standards and interfaces for how we share embeddings. There's some awesome work on that already, but really kind of centering that as a community. And then how do we report and document how these models are trained? One of the things that has come up frequently for me when I'm talking to folks in my research network who are really more on the user side of embeddings, they want to know like data provenance. They want to know like what data is captured by these embeddings, because that might really change what they're able to do with downstream causal inference where they don't want interference effects, for example. So lots and lots to work on here that is not just building better Earth embeddings models and better ways of storing them, but is really also about fostering this community where we're making sure that the efforts we're putting forward on the AI side are actually aligned with how people want to use and build on these embeddings for other purposes. So for me personally, some of the next most exciting questions are really on if we think of Earth embeddings as kind of new paradigm for geospatial AI, what do we need out of those Earth embeddings? How can we think about evaluating the quality of those embeddings that goes beyond multitask performance on a hopefully comprehensive suite of downstream prediction tasks? How do we center things like efficiency and usability, and things like spatial residual errors? Those are all really interesting questions on the evaluation side. And then, of course, many of these models are, especially in the location encoder side, that implicit neural representation, quite in their infancy. And so there's a lot of opportunity to actually just make those better and increase the representational capacity of Earth embeddings, as well as really centering the temporal aspect. This is another thing that folks who are in the Earth and environmental sciences are always like, well, we care a lot about temporal variation. So these are all angles that my research lab at Boulder is working on. So if you're interested in or already working on any of these directions and you want to like bounce ideas off each other, here's how to reach me. My email is on my website. It's just my first name dot last name at colorado.edu. Thanks everybody so much for coming along on this, for me, morning run through of different, basically like my journey through Earth embeddings, an abridged version. I'm gonna stop sharing the slides so that I can see everybody now. I'm hoping no one had questions that I missed throughout the talk. And we have about 10 minutes left for questions now, if anyone has them.
Great. First of all, thank you so much. This was super interesting. Maybe I can start with a question. In the context of SetClip, you were also mentioning that instead of images, you could directly train on maps, for example, forest cover and so on. So I was wondering what your perspective is on integrating those high-quality maps into retraining embedding models.
Yeah. Awesome question. I think that's exactly where I would love to see us going as a community. Like, honestly, before I had a conversation last week with some of the folks that I work with who are more on the like environmental economic side, I was like, let's get all the data into these compressed representations. That's a goal, right? It's like almost to the level of digital twins. How do we compress all of the data we have about Earth into embeddings that we can use as like general purpose, flexible, agile form? And the motivation there is like, we have a bunch of this data already. We have so many data layers on land cover. We have DEM maps. We have multispectral satellite imagery. We have SAR imagery. We have all of that data from like the missions that were on the very first or second slide there. Integrate them all together. And there's so many exciting papers that are actually coming out to this effect, right? Using different subsets of possible Earth observation data and fusing that into a foundation model or an embeddings data set, that I really think that's an important direction to be going. And I'll also nuance that a little bit with, that's why I was a little surprised when my research friends from the economics were like, that might not be good for us, right? So they were saying things like, well, if we're trying to to estimate the causal impact of an intervention, right? That's economists really want to know, like, if we did cash transfers to try and get people to stop cutting down trees, did it actually work? A year later, or the areas where we gave those transfer credits, like cash incentives, basically, do those areas have their trees and the other areas have trees cut down? This is really oversimplified, but just so everyone's kind of on the same page. So if we have other variables in there that contribute to the embeddings, something maybe like average income across all of these areas, that actually messes with their causal inference if they're using a embeddings-based prediction of how much tree cover there is in different regions, and that embeddings-based product has baked into it things like the different relative income across different regions, that can actually mess with the validity of their causal inference downstream. And so I'm basically saying we need to do both of these, right? We need to be including all of the data that we have, because this is the promise of this unified representation, is not just to represent what's in optical imagery really well, but we have so much information about the globe, and it's really hard to coalesce that across things like acoustic data and imagery data. But at the same time, I think that notion of data provenance and interpretability and allowing users to kind of turn on and off certain inputs becomes really important. And that's one of those things, again, where like I'm telling you all because I don't think that's obvious as an AI person. And it's one of those things where like I probably wouldn't have appreciated that without the context of collaborators outside of computer science. Much like with the original MOSAIKS project, I wouldn't have realized that so many people are facing compute barriers. And that seems almost silly in retrospect now that I kind of understand the landscape a little bit better. But I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. And I think that's something where like communities like this that can bring in perspectives from people who are trying to use and people who are trying to build Earth embeddings become really important, because it's super unsustainable if every single researcher has to kind of figure out that landscape on their own. It really is something that like a community is well set up to service.
Yeah, thank you so much for answering.
Yeah.
I leave the stage to some more questions. I think we also had something in the chat. I don't know. No. We have one in the chat.
Okay. I'm going to read it out loud so that I can parse it. So Moti said, I had a question. As MOSAIKS shows, these random convolutional features almost beat many foundation models. And would you anticipate the intuitions would apply similarly to synthetic aperture radar as well? This is a good question. So I'm not going to make the claim that MOSAIKS beats many foundation models. I will say it's a very competitive baseline in many cases. And I think there's two ways to kind of think about what that means in the context of multispectral imagery that then I think would generalize to what we're seeing with SAR as well. But I leave that generalization up as a hypothesis. So the idea that MOSAIKS as a very wide and shallow network is a good encoder of relevant information, like air quotes on information there, but the aspects of satellite imagery that we would want to carry forward in a general purpose embedding. You can see that as the motivation from the slide with the red panda versus the satellite images, that the structure in this imagery can be extracted with a simple model. And so we definitely do see gains to more complex models, but those gains may be more marginal than in the like natural imagery space, where random convolutional features are like, they're a reasonable baseline, but they are by far not the best method, right? They're not a competitive baseline anymore for things like ImageNet. But for satellite imagery, they are. So maybe that's actually saying we don't need really deep models to encode satellite imagery. Maybe it's saying we're not encoding satellite imagery the most effective way with any of these models. And there's actually the biggest bump in performance that we're going to get is from some totally different approach. And so I won't try and generalize that too far into the SAR embedding space. But I think SAR is a prime example of where like you wouldn't necessarily want to just lift and shift models over from the computer vision traditional domain, because that data has a very different structure. Again, you can format it as rasters, but it's even farther, I would say, from natural imagery than the satellite imagery is. So kind of in the spirit of that position paper, where we're arguing satellite data is a distinct modality, I would say that like thinking about SAR and other Earth observation data products as really their own modality and kind of starting from the properties of data when we design the encoders will end up being, I think, a really interesting direction. And then Mochi, you had one more point to this question, and then Jonathan, I see you have your hand raised too. Mochi said, on another note, on embeddings database versus embedding models, I think I'm not sure. I suspect remote sensing foundation models have time drift, so they're less performant on later years. Embeddings of the database will make it easy to maintain best embeddings for each location and time. Yeah, excellent point. I agree with this. And I also would say this is something else that comes up for a lot of users downstream, right? They don't want time steps to bleed into each other the way that the implicit neural representations like almost they don't enforce, but they're kind of implicitly they have this smoothness to them over space and time that you may not want if you're trying to do like differences in one year versus another. You want actually the embeddings of what is happening in those specific time steps, not some smoothed version of that. So absolutely agree. Jonathan, you have your hand raised.
Sorry. Yeah, thanks a lot. Really great talk. Very interesting. I was wondering, because you compared a little bit to alphas and other mills, and you mentioned Mosaic being 1 kilometer. If you had seen like applications where actually using the 1 kilometer resolution was better than the high resolution alpha Earth, or where there are limitations to that scale, and where it kind of breaks down. And I don't know, maybe like when you're doing something at the regional scale or a country scale, you're more interested in having an embedding at the kilometer scale. Yeah, if you had any thoughts on
yeah that? Great question. My immediate response to that is I think it depends a lot on the use case and the user needs for the embeddings. So I had like one slide up with the detecting artisanal mining across all of sub-Saharan Africa. One of the really nice things about MOSAIKS being at 1 by 1 kilometer scale is we can generate those maps fairly efficiently because we're not dealing with like 10-meter pixels. So just the volume of data that we're running through for the prediction step, it's at the tile level, right? Because we're working in embedding space. Versus to use Alpha Earth or to use a UNet and have actually any segmentation model to have segmentations of mines, it's going to be a lot more computationally intensive. And it really depends on what are you trying to do at the end of the day. And so this is another time where I was humbled by my computer science I don't know, preconceived notions of what people would want, right? So maybe this is a theme of my reflection of doing this interdisciplinary work where people are going to use the outputs. I always thought, yeah, like the folks that we would give these maps of mining to want to have like the nice polygon outlines of where all the satellite imagery is. And that's, some people would probably want that. And some of our teammates on the project who are in conversation with folks who would use these maps said, no, like they don't want to deal with downloading the satellite imagery and overlaying these polygon maps, like just downloading that data alone on limited internet connectivity, like that's going to be such a hassle. They just want you to give them like points with a 1 kilometer radius on where you think mining is happening, and they will go out on the ground and check that. And I was like, well, wouldn't they want to look at the image first before they like go and drive out to these remote regions? And she said no. They just want the map of latitude, the list of latitude, longitude places to go check. And so I think it really depends. They could have said we want very specific pinpointed places, and then the 1 kilometer resolution would really be kind of not the best for that use case. Or if we were looking at a like hyper local region and we wanted really specific maps that are going to be super spatially fine-grained, then yeah, MOSAIKS at the 1 kilometer level is probably not the right idea. So that's where this embeddings as a database way of sharing, it has these limitations because you kind of have to make these decisions for your potential users as to what resolution of data is going to be useful for them. And we juggled a lot with this, with the MOSAIKS project, and we landed on roughly 1 kilometer as a unit that most people could hopefully do something with. Hopefully it's not overwhelmingly high resolution. And like we were all academic researchers, right? And we were working on academic research budgets, and the features were being stored somewhere in the Bay Area in California on one of our university clusters. So we were also facing constraints that big companies may be able to serve embeddings at much higher resolution. And I think that comes back again to like, how do we share the computational resources that are going to be required here, and what players are going to be best positioned to serve embedding databases? It's probably going to be organizations with a lot of engineers and a lot of computational infrastructure. And that is just like companies right now, right? Whereas I think we can all benefit from like partnering together to think about what that looks like. Okay, I think I answered your question and then went on a tangent. So thank you for bearing with me there.
No, that was perfect. Thanks a lot. Very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks everyone for also being patient with my morning slow brain here. Hopefully everything was making sense.
Hey, we're already over the hour, so some people already started dropping. But as you said, I think everybody's welcome to reach out to you with any follow-up questions. Once again, I found it super interesting. Thank you so much for taking the time early in the morning. And maybe to you and to all of the other people here as well, feel free to always reach out to me if you would like to present here or have someone in mind for one of the upcoming meetings. Yeah, I think today showed greatly how good the topic was a fit for our group here. So thanks a lot.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Feel free to reach out.
Bye.